dompter des flambeaux à la lisière des nuits.
نفس الشمس بتشرق علي وعليك نفس النجمة بعيوني بتضوي بعينيك
Solidariedade constrói amizade até sem querer. Faz com que a bondade se instale sem saber. Com boa vontade vamos estender as mãos, promovendo a união pra poder melhor viver.
La grande ville nous a plongé dans sa cohue. Dehors, y a pas d'étrangers, y a que des inconnus. Solidarité, voilà ce qu'on est venu demander. La beauté n'a pas de frontières, les frontières n'ont pas de beauté.
Nous sommes les nouveaux rois, nous sommes les nouveaux rois, nous sommes les nouveaux rois. Vous êtes les nouveaux rois, vous êtes les nouveaux rois, vous êtes les nouveaux rois.
No, 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 no.
एकता ही परम धर्म है इससे बड़ा न कोई
Hello. Okay, this is on. Good morning, everybody. I hope you had a very nice first day of the conference. My name is Karen Del Biondo. I work at the European Commission, DG INTPA, in Unit D1, Effective Development Policy and Team Europe. It's a pleasure. We co-organized this conference. In a previous life, I was also an academic working on development cooperation issues, particularly European development policies. So I see a lot of familiar faces. Very nice to see you and very happy to be back, at least briefly. So this is the second panel on ownership of aid, and we have 4 presenters. So just to remind the presenters that you have 15 minutes each. And we will start with Malin Hasselskoch, from the School of Global Studies in University of Gothenburg. She has a paper that she co-wrote with Joachim Öjendahl and Vedastin Dizera, also from the University of Gothenburg, and it's on connecting national ownership and local participation in aid recipient countries in Rwanda and Cambodia. So Malin, please come up.
Good morning, everybody. It's very nice to be here. The presentation that I'll make is based on a paper that I'm working on together with 2 colleagues. It's a study that has, for various reasons, been repeatedly delayed, and we are currently starting to look at the first empirical material. So it's very much work in progress. It looks into the possible relation between national ownership on the one hand and local participation on the other. And we're trying to figure out what local participation may look like in situations of strong national ownership. A starting point for the study is the enduring concern in international development cooperation with inherent inequality between those who receive and those who provide aid resources. For almost as long as there has been development cooperation, there have, within the aid community, been ambitions and efforts to come to terms with this inequality by increasing recipient agency, initiative, and influence. Oh, thank you. One strand of such efforts aims at increasing local participation, which has been promoted at least since the 1960s. It emerged among radical thinkers calling for emancipatory participation that would empower marginalized actors and make development more relevant, more equal, more sustainable. From the 1980s, local participation was rapidly adopted, also in large-scale development interventions, and by the late 1990s, it had gained status as what has been called a development orthodoxy. The radical aims are still expressed, but local participation is also promoted because it's expected to make development activities more efficient and cost-effective. Throughout, the core idea is that people should be involved in defining needs, priorities, solutions, and in making decisions that concern them, rather than being exposed to externally determined interventions. Another expression of the ambition to increase recipient influence is, of course, the ownership agenda, well known from Paris and beyond. The idea that developing countries should set their own policies was, of course, not new by then. Similar standards are reflected in much older principles of national sovereignty and non-interference, but with the aid effectiveness agenda, national ownership emerged as a key principle, with the underlying idea that for aid to be effective, development priorities and strategies should be determined domestically rather than by external actors. National ownership is as centrally concerned with the degree of external influence on national policymaking. And the OECD's 2008 progress report, for example, explicitly calls for a shift of power in the aid relationship from those who provide to those who receive resources. These kind of ambitions that continuously emerge within development thinking and practice, and that come to be unanimously nurtured within the aid community, they are often referred to as buzzwords, which may sound pejorative. Behind these popular concepts are, of course, good intentions. They are indeed appealing ideals, which also makes them easy to agree on. Employing the ideals and realizing the ambitions, however, is more difficult. And practices of both local participation and national ownership have been thoroughly and critically analyzed. There are countless studies of participatory practices, and among common shortcomings are that local participation may not provide for influence on important decisions, but instead serve to legitimize what has already been externally decided. Also, local participation may reinforce local inequalities, since there's a tendency that those who participate are the locally most influential. Yet an obstacle is that local participation may imply a burden on people who are busy making a living and earning an income, and that the most tangible forms of participation is sometimes contributions in labor and cash rather than influence. Practices of national ownership have of course also been extensively analyzed, and here a major strand of critique is related to that donor representatives are closely involved in the policy process in aid recipient countries, and that thereby ownership may imply that recipient states commit to and take responsibility for donor-preferred policies rather than exercising control over the policy agenda. So in both cases, the critique points to that it's difficult to do away with that inequality in the aid relationship, and that providers' influence tend to remain strong. These analyses of participation and ownership practices, respectively, they tend to be treated in separate bodies of research. Still, there are apparent assumptions about their interrelation. They tend to be treated as some sort of conceptual siblings, usually mentioned together, national ownership and local participation, or local ownership and participation, often also along with partnership. And that may not be surprising. They both concern the aid relationship, they both aim at increasing recipient influence, but it does also give the impression that they go hand in hand. And this is where I got a bit curious. Do they really? Overall levels of national ownership increase, according to continuous monitoring and progress reports. But as depicted, ownership largely implies strong government leadership. Some factors, such as having a clear development vision, a coherent policy framework, clearly formulated priorities and strategies linked to budgets, coordinating aid providers, that may all be easier to achieve if decision-making is fairly concentrated. Also, as scholarly analyzed, national ownership denotes state capacity, commitment, assertiveness, and empirical research indicates that strong national ownership often coincides with centralized state control and policymaking, which may not be conducive to local participation, which takes time and which can be expected to come up with much more diverse visions and priorities. When talking about increasing levels of national ownership, it's important to emphasize that it's increasing also for other reasons than the ownership agenda. The importance of traditional aid is decreasing, or other financial flows and sources of revenue are increasingly available, which allows more room for domestically setting the development agenda in line with national ownership. So with such increase of national ownership, what happens to the role and nature of local participation? That's what we want to study. And we decided to do so by looking at Rwanda and Cambodia, two countries that have, over the last 3 decades, received large amounts of international aid. They have both moved from a phase of emergency and quick impact support towards longer-term development. And they have throughout been exposed to different aid trends and ideals, including those of local participation and national ownership. Local participation has been strongly promoted by aid providers, not least through support to decentralization reform, to civil society, and to various specific participatory programs. And as everywhere, national ownership has, over the same period, been increasingly emphasized and has, in both countries, got stronger. So, looking first at Rwanda. Here, ownership was early quite strong. Already in the mid-1990s, the government emphasized its policy independence. By 2000, there was a firmly formulated development vision. By 2004, there was a sophisticated aid coordination structure. And by 2006, there was a national aid policy, which stated that the government was now in a position to assert a genuine leadership. And since then, the government has continued to follow the Paris Agenda in terms of domestic policy formulation, aid coordination, policy dialogue, popular consultation, and more. The Rwandan government has, however, not stopped at complying with the Paris Agenda. It has also come to resolutely manage its aid providers. A division of labor has, for example, been introduced, with the government assigning sectors among the donors. The quality and volume of external finance is closely monitored and assessed. Individual donors' performance is carefully evaluated, and results are continuously published. Meanwhile, the Rwanda government has persistently articulated its commitment to local participation. Throughout policy documents, the importance of local participation is emphasized, and it is to be achieved through a far-reaching decentralization reform, which is explicitly aimed at empowering the population, through so-called homegrown solutions, many of which are asserted to revive traditional participatory practices, and through active engagement with civil society, which is recognized both as a participating player in itself and as a promoter of popular participation. And while the Rwandan ownership is largely appreciated, external scholars have been largely critical of participation practices in the country. So, what current experiences are there of local participation in Rwanda? We have interviewed CSO representatives and local officials and beneficiaries who are involved in these CSO's activities. And our preliminary findings point to that CSO representatives are familiar with and favorable of local participation. They know very well the intentions of it, and they're also able to point to problems of non-participation. And some of them have seen a marked change from a more top-down approach. The material also points to well-known obstacles to local participation. One is people's previous experiences, which may make them expect to receive handouts and to follow instructions rather than to speak up. Another is suspicions. We have come across people not trusting, for example, that they will be allowed to keep the land that they are encouraged to invest in. Also, and not least, people are busy. They are busy making a living, and they prefer, or they might have to prioritize paid work rather than participating in development activities. Still, there are also instances of participation with people influencing the CSO's activities. For example, when it comes to the selection of beneficiaries, and particularly when it comes to the sort of input provided. What is also clear from the material is that the CSOs align their activities closely with national policies and goals, throughout working in close collaboration also with the local authorities. They also need to adjust to external funders, but they say that they do so to quite a limited extent. If we then move over to Cambodia, here national ownership increased later and more suddenly than in Rwanda. In the 1990s, the country was heavily dependent, not only on aid funds, but also on technical assistance. The country was described as a laboratory for donor experiments. But from the early 2000s, the government got more assertive, more firmly expressing its priorities, less readily accepting aid conditionalities. It increasingly formulated its own development policies, a more coherent policy framework was constructed, and ambitious development targets were set. And then in 2006, a national aid strategy was adopted, which stated that ownership was strong and that the government leadership would be further strengthened. When it comes to local participation, from the 1990s, there were loads of participatory development programs implemented, designed and driven by donors, accepted by the government. There was a far-reaching decentralization reform, initiated and funded by donors, later taken over by the government. Civil society was also supported by international aid. Lots of NGOs were created and came to constitute quite a vibrant sector. Ethnographic research pointed to many of the common obstacles of local participation, but also to relative success. Meanwhile, the ruling party's dominance increased, and in 2017 came a return to authoritarian rule and government control. Many international actors have left, and the Cambodian government does not express any interest in local participation. So, what current experiences are there in Cambodia? Preliminary analysis of recent interviews with CSO actors indicate that they perceive an increased need to comply with government regulation and to follow government policy in their activities. According to some, this has decreased their legitimacy among foreign funders. They have less contact with the international aid community. They receive less funds. Some also think that foreign funders now avoid interfering in their activities and put less pressure on the CSOs to reach certain goals and targets, which is appreciated. Meanwhile, there are also indications that the compliance with central government regulation and policy makes it easier for the CSOs to cooperate with local authorities, who are now closely involved in their activities. And throughout, the local participation that takes place as part of these CSOs' activities is limited. People tend to turn up for trainings and meetings when they are called, but they do not seem to have much influence. So, what can we say about the role and nature of local participation in these situations of national ownership? In one case, Rwanda, the government actively and strongly engages with local participation. Participatory practices are designed and introduced as part of national policies, and CSOs work in close collaboration with the state. In other words, local participation is made active use of by the government, and its role is to serve the implementation of national policies and the reaching of national goals. In the other case, Cambodia, local participation was more driven by aid providers. It was accepted, partly taken over, but mainly accepted by the government. With less dependence on traditional aid and with authoritarian rule, CSOs make sure to comply with government regulation, and their partly participatory activities are tolerated as long as they do not challenge those in power. But the government does not take an interest in local participation, and its role is diminishing. So the two governments' very different approaches to local participation, I would say, are partly reflected in their different approaches to national ownership. Rwandan ownership is the result of a determined policy to claim policy independence, of active and firm management of aid providers, with the government skillfully using the development rhetoric. Cambodian ownership is more the result of high growth rates and a conscious strategy to accept aid from China and other non-traditional donors. So we have national ownership for different reasons, and we have different ways of relating to and using local participation, and different sorts of participation practices emerging. This should not come as a surprise. National ownership and local participation cannot be assumed to go hand in hand. In situations of strong national ownership, a certain form of local participation should not be expected to be promoted and exercised. If the development model is to be determined domestically, in line with national ownership, we reasonably don't know what the priorities and strategies will be. So whether local participation is valued and promoted, and if so, what sort of participation and for what purposes, that all depends on if those who set the national agenda think that it's a good idea and what role they may see for local participation. Thank you.
Is this on? Great. Sorry for interrupting you, but I thought it would be easier from here. So next up we have Stephen Brown from School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa. And he will present on effective development cooperation and sexual and gender minorities. You have the floor, 15 minutes.
Great, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be on this panel. I think my paper is quite complementary with Malin's and also with the panel yesterday, the other panel on ownership. And I don't actually have ownership in the title of my paper, but it's actually very much present, as you will soon see. So, quick outline. I'm going to talk about norms and when norms collide. thinking about it this morning, I think maybe norms is overstating it. Maybe overarching principle would be a better term. It might not meet all the technical qualifications of a norm, but I'm just going to call them norms for this talk, just to keep things simple. So the first norm is the idea of leaving no one behind. The overarching message of the SDGs is leave no one behind. It's all about inclusion. And the other norm is about ownership. And my question here, or the collision, comes from what do you do with certain populations that might be extremely marginalized, and the population that the populations that I'm interested in here are LGBTQ plus people. And I'll just put a parenthesis, it's a problematic term. You might not be able to apply it to everybody. I'm not implying that everybody necessarily identifies as LGBTQ plus, but I'm talking about sexual and gender minorities, however they choose to define themselves, or even not have an identity at all. So what do you do when you have one norm that says include everyone, and another norm that says let's follow national priorities, national plans, etc., in countries that might actually be hostile to LGBTQ plus people and rights? So there's a clash. And at the very end, I'll present some ideas that I would love to have feedback on how we might be able to solve this conundrum. So I'm going to focus on the development cooperation norms, as I said, the SDGs and the principles of aid effectiveness and development effectiveness. So Paris, Accra, Busan, etc. I could talk about other international norms and instruments, such as human rights law or international law, but I'm not going to. I'm limiting it to development cooperation. And though I'm focusing on sexual and gender minorities, this could be extended to other marginalized populations. It could be ethnic minorities. It could be, actually, it could apply to women in some cases. It could apply to disabled people. It could apply to other groups as well that are marginalized. Now, this crowd knows about the SDGs, so I'm going to go through very, very quickly. So adopted unanimously. It has overarching principles of universality and social inclusion. The term social inclusion comes up a lot. Timothy Donnet brought it up yesterday. He talked about how it was rather vague. I'm going to push it as actually a little bit less vague because of some of the language. So we pledge that no one will be left behind. And remember how, was it Theresa May who said Brexit means Brexit? I will say no one means no one. It means universal inclusion. It doesn't mean we're going to include a lot of people, it means everybody. And crucially, reach the furthest behind first, which means additional emphasis on those who are more marginalized. So priority to people like LGBTQ plus people in countries where they are marginalized. So the norms, so the individual goals often have important implications for sexual and gender minorities. So number 3, which talks about healthy lives and well-being for all, that means that LGBTQ people should not be excluded by healthcare systems, should have access to condoms, to HIV prevention programs, to treatment, whereas in a lot of places they're turned away from healthcare providers. That trans people should have access to healthcare that meets their specific requirements, which is so often not the case, including in the global north. SDG 4 talks about inclusivity in education. So that means students should not be kicked out of their schools for being LGBTQ+. Work, productive employment and decent work for all. So that means people should not be excluded from the workplace, should not be fired, should not be not hired because they are LGBTQ+. And then finally, number 16, which Timothy talked about yesterday, yes, about peaceful and inclusive societies, access to justice for all, and inclusive institutions at all levels. So for me, these are very clear statements about the police cannot harass people just for being LGBTQ+. Worth pointing out is that even in countries where homosexuality is illegal, it is the homosexual act that is illegal. It's not being gay or being lesbian or being bi. So arresting somebody who's walking down the street, arresting them for being gay, that is actually illegal in most countries where homosexuality is illegal, because they're not actually having sex when they're walking down the street with someone of the same sex. So access to courts, not being harassed by the police, not being discriminated against, not being subjected to things like forced anal exams, which are classified by the UN as torture, which under very dodgy science is meant to allow police or other people to determine whether somebody is gay. So the SDGs have many clear messages around that, even if they don't talk about sexual and gender minorities. There is literature on how marginalized people have trouble reaching many of these specific goals, and there is some literature on how individual SDGs can be made more attainable for people, LGBTQI plus people. But then the question is, what if there's a lack of ownership? So let's go into that. Again, this crowd knows about, I mean, even as Malin said, the principle of ownership predates Paris. It's been codified, debated, redefined. The idea is that to improve aid and then later development effectiveness, we need to have ownership as the cornerstone of effectiveness agendas. It's where things like alignment and harmonization derive from, in the first place, ownership, the identification of ownership. The concept itself, as the previous panel and this panel is highlighting, is actually problematic in some ways. Here's one way it's described in the Paris definition, Paris Declaration, that says that it means that developing countries exercise effective leadership over the development policies and strategies and coordinate development actions. And the Agenda 2030 also reiterates the importance of ownership. So it's not just SDGs versus the effectiveness agenda. They both talk about both in some ways. So there's the phrase in the Agenda 2030 about national ownership being key to achieve sustainable development. But when we say ownership, whose ownership are we talking about? And many different documents talk about government ownership or country ownership or national ownership or local ownership or inclusive ownership or democratic ownership. And I'm sure there are other terms as well that I haven't listed here. Who speaks for the nation or the country, or is it the executive of the government? Is it the president? Is it the legislature? How representative are these institutions, especially in non-democracies, but also in democracies? Is there some kind of obligation to have consultations? And I think this links up a bit with the idea of participation in Malin's paper. But we all know that you can have participations and control what's on the agenda, who goes to the participations, and also you can ignore what people at the participations say. And having participated in consultations in Canada with the government, with the House of Commons, and with the Senate, I know that many different people will go and say many different things, and then they can write up a report and they say, well, we heard this, and they pick the one that they already had decided on. So how meaningful are consultations in determining national ownership? What is the role of civil society? Who speaks on behalf of civil society? Because it's not like all NGOs or all organized CSOs agree on everything. The private sector is even harder to integrate. There's some language about that, but who speaks on behalf of the private sector? Like, is it Elon Musk, or is it the woman who runs the tailor shop down the street? Or and then at the basis, there's, I think, a myth that you can have some kind of majority view or even consensus on what our priorities should be. Because even very simple binary questions about, is that 5 minutes? Yes, okay, thanks. Brexit or Remain, or Trump or Biden or Clinton or whatever. Like, countries split down the middle on a simple-ish binary question of A or B. So, like, what should our country's development priorities be? How do you build a consensus around something that's that complicated? Pick the two people on that row and the two people behind them. Try to get, your country to have, to agree on priorities for your country, assuming you're from the same country. It's going to be really different. Try ordering a pizza where you can agree on what the ingredients are going to be, and that's almost impossible. So there's a bit of a myth of, somehow getting this. Very quickly, some countries are quite hostile to LGBTQI plus people. Same-sex sexual acts are actually criminalized in 67 UN member states. There are provisions for death penalty in several countries, but it's not clear that it's actually used anywhere, but it's on the books. What are the implications? So many governments and often public opinion actually support criminalization and the exclusion of sexual and gender minorities. So the government might say this is illegal, and the population, according to opinion polls, might say, yes, this is illegal. We should not be providing services to these criminals. So even on a very generous definition of how broad ownership needs to be, ownership might be deny health care to LGBT people, kick them out of schools, do not employ them, throw them in jail. So presumably I don't have to say to this crowd why that could be problematic to just accept ownership in that level. Maybe a compromise in the development area, and this is what's done in a number of countries, is to provide discreetly some services to what's often called KVPs, key vulnerable populations. That's often drug users in the health sector, drug users, mostly MSM, men who have sex with men, and sex workers. And sort of working under the radar, funding some NGOs, some clinics, but those things can be terminated. And in Tanzania, for instance, over the past 5 years, the government has just shut down many of these programs. So it's not just, so the compromise is actually really vulnerable, and it doesn't recognize things like rights and protection and inclusion and dignity and the idea of leaving no one behind, and the idea that you should actually prioritize the most marginalized. So I would say that compromise is unsatisfactory and very vulnerable to being reversed. So what to do instead? First is, do we need to bring together these two norms? Do they have to be made compatible? And do norms actually really matter? Or these principles, do they really matter? And I would say yes. We can get into that in Q&A. So can the idea of leave no one behind trump ownership without actually imposing it? Are we going to say that even if national ownership means excluding these populations, that leaving no one behind is more important? You could say, well, the SDGs were adopted unanimously at the UN, but also they did recognize the key element of ownership. So it's hard to say that one trumps the other because, as I mentioned, they both contain both principles. The last 10, if not 30 years of discussions of ownership have shown that there are limits to this concept. So maybe it's an aspiration, just like the SDGs, that we shouldn't hold it as something that's absolute that must be attained. What I will argue for in the 1 minute that remains probably, is for an alternative conceptualization of ownership. And I really would like feedback on this if other people have thought about this, worked about it, read about it, and so on. So inclusivity actually means prioritizing all marginalized voices and groups. And we need to reconceptualize ownership as localized. And by this, I mean that the ownership doesn't have to be with, say, the government. So that if we're talking about effectiveness, it's the people or the groups that you're working with that need to share those priorities, share the belief, and that will make the work more effective. So working with a human rights NGO or an LGBT rights NGO, for instance, if you are funding their work, they have ownership of that. You are not imposing that. So that is compatible with the idea of ownership, even if it isn't compatible with the idea of national ownership in some cases. So contextualizing it being about ownership really at the lowest level, not at the government level, not at the state or provincial level, not even at local government, but all the way down to who the partners are. And maybe also think of ownership as a process, something to be built from the bottom up. So if you're working with LGBTQ plus groups, part of what you're doing is you're promoting their rights, or you're helping them promote their own rights. And part of their work is to convince the rest of their country and their government that these rights are worth being recognized and protected. So national ownership or country ownership could actually be built that way rather than just assume that it pre-exists or not. And then a final word, as I said earlier, these thoughts are based on LGBTQI plus rights, but I do think they could be applicable to other marginalized groups. So like I said earlier, it could be the disabled, it could be women, which is a majority group in other countries. So I don't mean it to be only restricted to LGBTQ plus people, even if that's what I focused on. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So the next paper will be presented via video conference, I understand by Shume Teshome. So it's on aid ownership and coordination in the agriculture sector in Ethiopia. So just checking with the technical team if we have, oh, that's great. Hello, Shume.
Hello,
Thanks for being virtually in the room. So you have the floor for your presentation.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much for the opportunity. And then unfortunately, I couldn't manage to be there because of visa issue. So my topic is aid ownership and the coordination in the agriculture system in Ethiopia. And with my co-author, Professor Paul from Netherlands. And so let me give you some background information and on this issue. So we know that aid effectiveness in the developing countries, and then especially in the sub-Saharan countries, African countries, is still a debated issue. And yes, yes, I am sharing it.
We are hearing you perfectly. Is there an issue from your side?
You can also see my slides. So sharing and then screen. Okay. Let's go. What about now? Slide is sharing or it works? Does it work? Okay. Yep. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Now it works, right? So, can I continue or? So you see my slides? Okay, great. So the issue is very debatable still, and even the results are inconclusive because the assumption is that the findings are not context specific. That's why we need to see it from the Ethiopian context, and then especially by having that the sectoral level coordination and ownership taking the Ethiopian case, so that we can see that we can develop this empirical evidences how these policy assumptions of the Paris Agenda can be reflected in the practice, and how this ownership and effective coordination can be explained by an Ethiopian case, taking that the agriculture sector as a critical sectoral case. So why Ethiopia? Why the agriculture sector? It's very clear because that the agriculture Ethiopia is a very agricultural-based economy, and we know that Ethiopia is very highly dependent on aid, and there are a number of donors in the landscape of the aid landscape, and there are also the involvement of the non-traditional or thousand donors in the landscape is increasing. And Ethiopia is to be known and to be assumed having homegrown agricultural development strategies. So that would have a very good implication for the country ownership. That's why we take that to see that empirical cases for the agriculture sector. And it's good also to see that the relationship between the donors and the Ethiopian, the agricultural as a recipient, should be just studied as a political economic context of Ethiopia, so you can see how the relationship goes from 1960s to this recent period, during the Haile Selassie regime and during the Derg regime, where the relationship was very close, and that more of that aid was humanitarian, but you can see from 1995 that RDF regime comes, and that the aid also will definitely rise. And then the relationship also goes with the relationship. This is the area where the Ethiopia was in a conflict with the Eritrean government, and you see that from 20s, that Ethiopia come up with different own homegrown agricultural programs, national development programs, poverty reduction programs, and aid also goes and then increase with this kind of relationships improvements. Some also with the humanitarian change aids. So this is the context that we can understand. I'm sorry, I have to plug my power. Sorry. I'm sorry for that. So we collect data from head of agencies, program officers, and agricultural specialists residing in Ethiopia, and then we also use different type of states. And we can see that the plans from the findings that we can see the plans in the programs, the Ethiopian case, are very important, were very important and have a good leverage for the ownership, and then also very important to have this coordination more practical in the case, in the sector. So you can see a list of these national programs and national strategies and plans, and then especially the flagship programs aligned with these plans were very important in the coordination. So that's why. So the analysis shows that the ownership and the alignment, the coordination were revolving, and then is mainly due to this plans, and then the ownership and then the political commitment of the government to set these priorities and then to lead the coordination using these programs. The interviews, all the data shows that the government was politically committed to coordinate through these plans. That's why you can see, if you can see that these plans, programs are mainly just following the poverty reduction and development programs from 20s. That's why the next slide shows you how that the financing financing basically for the government and then also from the donor side increased, particular increase and very significantly high, and starting from 20s. Where that the policies were there, where that the policies were practical in the process. So that this is very important indication. Financing and then the percentage of expenditure to the GDP, percentage of expenditure of agriculture to the total expenditure was very much high, and that's also comparably to the other African countries, in the sub-Saharan African countries. It was relatively impressive. And then the CADEP settings, and then the CADEP minimal requirement, 6%. It was exceeding that requirement, and then the PIP requirement, 8%. It exceeds the percentage of financing from the government. The commitment was high from the government, and the compliments by the donors was also very good. So from this now, and then you can see also from 2020s, and before that it was fluctuating, and not stable one, but from the 2000s onwards, given the plans, following the plans, and then it becomes steady and then increase the growth of agriculture, and then also it shows that it very complements and then it supports the increasement, the improvement in the national GDP also. So agriculture is actually the very foundation that contributes 40% of the GDP of Ethiopia. And it's how it's become stable and high from the plan. Definitely, this can be associated with the plans, with ownership, the coordination was very definitely. But unfortunately, we can see also that aid fragmentation slightly reduced from the 2014, just 1 year before the Paris Declaration, but it reduced, but actually still it's high. That fragmentation is high still. Actually, this is not the essence of the Paris Declaration. Actually, we compared also this fragmentation with the health sector. We also have analysis on a study on the health sector. Still, the health sector is fragmentation is high. Even it increased from the 2014 to the 2014. And then at national level, still fragmentation is high. But at the agricultural level, it's slightly reduced, but still it's high. But the problem is the cause for this fragmentation is some bilateral donors and some also large donors. So this is one thing. And we can see also when we go to the coordination structure, the coordination structure, we have at the sector level, we have the rural economic development and food security, RED and FS coordination structure. Actually, that coordination is at the Ministry of Finance with the DAG, basically at national level, but at sectoral level we have a functional, very complex, but practical also coordination structure, where that the government also show strong political leadership, and we saw also that there are also good practices of this program-based approach, especially that the AGP, Agricultural Growth Program, there is a pool funding there, and all the and it's managed by the Ministry of Agriculture, so that they can apply for the priorities with high level of flexibility. They are very happy, but unfortunately that the finance to this funding is small. But it's a very interesting and then practicable program-based approach. However, we can see also from this complex structure, USAID is absent, and some EU institutions are also do have parallel structures. So that's also that the southern the donors from the south, like China, which are very important in the production sector, are missing from this structure. Generally, now putting the policy assumptions of this Paris agenda, now we can see that the results are mixed. Relatively, we have strong government leadership, especially the political commitment at the top is good, even though there are the functional level at lower level, the capacity is still a question. It's still a missing gap, but the political leadership is high because of these national plans that that drives the leverage for this ownership, and there is also very defined coordination structure, DAG, even though that REDF is complex, but still it's functional, and that the program-based approach, especially at this AGP aspect, is very much practical. Still, that real dialogue is missing in that context, because from the interviews from the partners, we can see that real dialogue is still missing, and then still as sharing of statements, not real dialogue is not there. And it's also in the civil society, the private sector is missing, so that we cannot talk about ownership in its complete sense, and that the major sectors, the major South donors like China are not included in there, in the platform. Actually, in the DAG also, some they are missing from that. And still fragmentation, aid fragmentation is the problem. And that, unfortunately, that large donors, that agriculture is not also the priority of large donors. That's why the fragmentation comes from some big bilateral donors due to this. So we see that they are very much interested in the health sector. The health sector is donor-darling sector compared to the agriculture sector, whereas the agriculture sector is equally important for the Ethiopian society, just Ethiopian economy, like other developing countries. So aid effectiveness can be understood in conclusion now, should be understood and then should be studied having this socio-political economic context of countries, and then practical just the context specificities even at sectoral, specific sector level, so that we can more understand. That's why, so that we can have a very different empirical case, so that we can judge aid effectiveness from that context specificity. So we believe, and then the studies also show, and then just as the literature also confirms, that aid could be productive if that recipient countries have their own development agenda, especially as we saw in the Ethiopian case, that the development programs very harmonized and then aligned with the national programs and also with global agendas like regional agendas and regional programs like CADIP. And so such alignments is very important, and that ownership is very, very much important. The political commitment, the leadership is also very critical, and then that's why these plans have become practical, implementable, a very strong political commitment. But still, that the implementation and the practice of this this program-based approach, like the pool funding and these flagship programs in the last that we see, there are more than 4 flagship programs in the sector, especially the AGP is very productive, is likely to be more productive. It's financed by the donors, and that such practices are very much important for the coordination and then also finally for the effectiveness, development effectiveness in general. But still, that commitment of donors towards these practices is very important, so that the more that they are committed, aid fragmentation less, it would become less, and then so that the capacity increase, then the total effect and the total effect will be much high. So I think these are the points that I have, and then I will be back during the discussion by answering questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shume. And then the last presenter is Deepapriya Bhattacharya, I hope I pronounced that well, from the Center for Policy Dialogue in Dhaka. And the paper is called Unpacking Ownership in Development Cooperation Effectiveness, Perspectives of Southern Recipients.
Good morning, everybody. Oh, that's good. I have already an ownership of the session now. Let me first tell you that what I'm going to talk about is a partial presentation of a relatively substantive research program which has been carried out by us at the Center for Policy Dialogue, along with a larger partnership with the Southern Voice think tanks across 3 continents. And the program has been supported by the European Commission. And of course, we were selected through a competitive process. So the fuller outcome we will be sharing soon in Geneva. But today we thought of providing a teaser and have some reality check how our findings resonates with such a qualified audience. So before I start, let me also mention 2 of my colleagues are here with me. I have Tawfiqul Islam Khan. Tawfiq, please. Is a senior research fellow at the Center for Policy Dialogue in Dhaka. And I have my other colleague, Najiba. She is a research associate at our center. And more than 30 researchers across 6, I don't think, more than 6 countries, almost 10 countries if you include the peer reviewers, and some of them are here today. Niels, I recognize from DIE, and in earlier participants is Stefan himself, who is in this from DIE, and many others over there. The 6 countries are Bangladesh, Rwanda, Rwanda, Tanzania, Kenya, El Salvador, of course, from Latin America, Bangladesh, and then what? And Uganda. And we had 6 country studies, but these are not country studies, these are sectoral studies in the specific countries. We picked up sector to explore the issues which we wanted to explore. And we had 4 thematic papers cutting across some of the cross-cutting issues, finding the intersectionality of some of these issues over there. So we picked on ownership for today's morning. I think the colleagues who have been speaking before me have made a very good points already, and I hope our presentation will be will resonate with some of the issues raised by the colleagues. So let's come to the issue of ownership. Ownership, the word has been quite often an elusive ideal for many of us, and we have always struggled to operationalize this concept across the various hallmarks of development cooperation milestones in many ways. I'll come to that. So the 4 issues which we use here to understand the problematic, where do I look at it with this one? Oh. Is that the first and foremost is that ownership by whom, that question has been raised, and we talk about a fuller ownership, that ownership both by the provider and the recipient. And in this case, on the recipient, on the provider side, we note that our studies show, you'll have to trust me when I make some assertions. There are country evidences behind that. So there is a loss of traction, political traction, on the part of the providers in many cases. And so as a result, and as you will see, that the geoeconomics is also taking, an overriding position, determinant. So in determining the selection of the countries, selection of the sectors as in these cases. So the intervention by the providers vis-a-vis the ownership problematic is a major issue over here. The second issue which we take on board is that the providers usually pick on the national programs. And as we will discuss later possibly, many of these national programs have been also funded by the providers. And in many cases, that the providers, what they put up is also not so much, although it apparently may look like demand-driven, but it is also very much a supply-driven process, as we see. This is the second issue of the problematic. The third issue of the problematic is that, although we talk about in many cases, and I will show you as various declarations and resolutions have shown, inclusivity of non-state actors, CSOs, NGOs, private sector. But we see in many countries now, there is the rise of the authoritarian state and the squeezing of the space for the civil society. So the possibility of having an ownership on the part of non-state actors is also very much under threat. Last but not the least, we never had a satisfactory set of measurable indicators for the ownership issue. That is another issue which will come later on that. These are the 4 issues which will underpin our analysis over here. So let's see how the ownership discourse has evolved over time. Well, we take 1996 as the point of departure, the OECD resolution. Then in 1999, we come to the Comprehensive Development Framework, CDF issue. On 1999 and 1999, we also had the structural adjustment strategy, PRSP papers. And then we will have in 2003, the first high-level meeting, 2005, the second high-level meeting, 2008, the second high-level meeting. And you see how the concept has over time broadened to bring in various kinds of stakeholders into the domain of ownership. And if you go through then the fourth high-level meeting and then the third international conference on financing for development and then the second high-level meeting of GPEDC, you will find that the exercise of accountable, strong leadership and inclusive ownership to national development agenda has been highlighted. That means that the ownership issue has been unpacked in terms of its backward linkages and then the forward linkages as we mentioned here in our discourse. So we cannot fault the evolution of thoughts, the global development community, in terms of not understanding the importance of inclusivity in terms of the ownership. What we want to say is that this is a fundamental, what you call proposition on our part is that these declarative statements were not commensurately implemented in terms of application and operationalization in the intergovernmental relationship or in case of choosing the programs and assessing them as we move forward. So we are finding there is a disjuncture between the declaration made by the international development community and the realities on the ground, and it does not really take into full cognizance the changing profile of both the recipient and the providers and the context within which they're operating, the ecosystem within which it is operating. So let's come to if you look back into the literature, we have a full review of literature, but we pick one because it was easier, because all the three authors were of the same surname, Kim, Kim, and Kim. So, and they make, I think, very good points, that they talk about country's commitment. They talk about intellectual conviction. I think this is a very important point they have making, and that it is resonate with this public, I think so. Intellectual conviction and support of the political leaders, which is essentially a issue of broadening the stakeholder groups and their representatives in certain ways. And you will see that we go on hammering on the term key stakeholders, not all stakeholders. And then we have the engage with the multiple stakeholders to have a broader consensus. Now, the issue of our paper, what it at the end of the day suggests, that it is time that you change the word ownership to collective ownership. That adjective has become very critical in order to absorb all the mandate which has been provided by the high-level forums, but also in terms of reflect them in reality in operationalization. So if you look at the issues which we say, that the paper essentially looking at different country experiences and would talking about that identification of the key stakeholders are very important. Not all, yes?
5 minutes. 5 minutes more.
You are undercutting my ownership now. Okay. So let me move forward and go to the concrete 4 ways which we want to see. So we were talking about essentially the key identification of the key stakeholders, finding a meaningful consultation process, and then aligning with the development framework. And most importantly, it is about the assessment part, which will in the development cooperation framework, which has become important. Now, 4 ways of these in the operationalizing this new approach, or a revamped approach which we are talking about, is there has to be a deliberate mention and an alignment not only with the national policies, but also with the sectoral policies. And what we have found, that even if there is a national government ownership, the line ministries, and we do look into education, social protection, and agriculture, and we have seen the line ministries were not necessarily very much, the implementing organizations were very much consulted, and there is a bit of a disjuncture over there. The second very important point which we think is the mode of financing. The mode of financing issue is critical from 2 very different levels. One, of course, is the local financing and the foreign financing, and it is being thought that the uptake of the government of the program after the foreign providers have exited is a sign of ownership in that way. Here we have found that it may lead to certain kinds of lack of optimization of the elements with which a program really run, because foreign funding has also supported not the physical infrastructure, but a large part of the soft part and what you call the innovative part. That it has been very evident in case of the education sector. The other part of it is the financing prism, is that the differentiation between creditor provider and the grant provider. The creditor providers always took a short-term look on the result-based management, whereas the grant provider had a much more structural view on the larger framework as it moved forward. So it is very important also when we look at the ownership, the form of financing coming from the external providers are quite important over here. The third issue which we bring here is the greater use of the local, the national systems. Here again, the financial management system use has been mentioned. What we do not see quite often is even within that how the fragmentation in terms of the accountability to the development partners takes place. We have seen continued need for providing monitoring reports to separate donors in a separate format, and even when they do a sectoral support program, they do not really always by one of the single program approach in the cartelization of the monitoring process has not fully taken place as it is. And last but not the least, the meaningful participation of the key stakeholders. The assessment is that the participation in order to ensure ownership is much more higher during the negotiation space, in the negotiation space when it has been conceptualized, and because many of the key stakeholders, North-East actors have done, NGOs, CSOs, and think tanks have done analysis over there. These are taken on board, but the participation diminishes as we go down the value chain, production. So it is the least where it should have been most in case of the assessment of the results. So this is one thing which comes out in the study, that we cannot really look in the ownership part just separately from all other things which are happening, whether it is the issue of alignment, it's a partnership, or use of result-based management. It remains as a motherhood proposition as we go. Let me conclude by saying, I still have 1 minute, that it has become important because most of the countries have now moved into the low middle income countries and having other forms of funding at this moment, coming not only from the private sector, blended finance, or vertical funds, or other things, but also South-South cooperation is also taking a big show over here. So in this case, there is a need to redefine these issues. I've also mentioned about the geopolitics and geoeconomics taking over in that way, and it is also the loss of traction, political traction in the countries of the providing countries. How do you create a new narrative for them from the prism of ownership, that the taxpayers, they see the ownership also over there. That's why we broaden the ownership concept both backward and downwards in that way. And the use of the exit policies of the IDPs are also becoming very important. The development partners are looking for exiting from these countries. And over here, how it will be taken over from the sustainability point of view, that makes the ownership issue even more important at this case. Colleagues, I think I wouldn't go further and take advantage of this circumstances. But I must tell you that this ownership issue is possibly one of the most critical elements of the GPEDC framework for the future in that way. If we do not address this issue, both conceptually and empirically, and provide an institutional framework to operationalize it in the future, I think GPEDC will lose much of its attraction in the coming days. And I'm pretty sure you will not allow us to do that. Thank you very much.
Maybe you can stay. We can sit there, all of us, and then take the questions. Yeah. Okay, thank you. It's been very interesting presentations, and as much as I'm tempted to abuse the chair role. I'm not going to do that because I'm sure that the public has a lot of questions. So are there any questions from your side? Yes, in the green, you're the first hand I saw.
Yeah, so thanks for all of the interesting presentations, and I have questions for all of them, but I will restrict myself to asking about just the last one. And I was interested in your consultations when you were talking about ownership, whether the idea of populism came up. So we've been having some conversations on power in development assistance, and one of the things that we've been hearing from the people we've been speaking to is how power is also affecting, or populism is affecting shrinking civil space. So how long-standing organizations who relied often on donor funding are increasingly unpopular in contexts where you have kind of both populist rhetoric, but you also might have popular social movements, and those organizations are also kind of struggling to find their place in, because they're very supportive sometimes of these popular social movements, but at the same time, they have this long history of being well tied to Western donors. And so I was just curious in your consultations if that came up and kind of what people were telling you about that.
Let's get some. May I continue? Okay. Thank you so much for great presentations on a very important aspect of development cooperation. My question is the following. In my view, the nature of development cooperation is changing very much. Let's say if you take the original ODA definition, it's about national, social and economic development. It's about priority setting by partner countries. What I see as a main trend over the last couple of years is that international development partners, some people still say donors, identify their most important thematic areas. So thematic allocation, global public goods or co-benefits, I mean, those are, I think, the typical new terms for how to allocate resources. So I'm not going to a country saying, what are your main priorities? I'm going there saying, I want to work on migration, in brackets, I want to reduce the number of people leaving your country, close the bracket again. I look at other topics, climate change. Yeah, I think international climate change funding is a typical situation where adaptation is the priority for partner countries. Mitigation is the priority of international development partners. So what I want to say is, on this overall level, how to allocate resources, which countries, which sectors, this is not any longer up to the partner countries. This is up to the supply side. So what I want to say is, shouldn't we consider, against the changing nature of development cooperation, what is our concept of ownership as such? I mean, you are still looking a bit at the old traditional development world. And what I'm saying is, this is not any longer what we see to a large extent in our development universe, which is very different. So maybe you have some reflections on this. So does this concept, in the way how you are presenting it, still apply to the reality we face? Thank you.
Okay, we have one question there in the back.
Thank you. Nalima Gulrajani, ODI. Great set of papers on ownership. I had a question, and sort of taking a step back from all four of them. The last speaker, Deb, you talked about collective ownership as a possible new framework, and I noticed that word also in the draft communique for the GPDC high-level forum. It does feel like that concept lies in somewhat opposition to the idea of local ownership that Stephen presented, where getting 4 people to agree on a pizza is hard enough. So how does broadening the concept help us get agreement over the pizza? Or is there a tension perhaps in the 2 recommendations of those 2 papers in particular? Thanks.
Okay, I think we have only time for maybe one round, so I would take that question. I think you were first. Yes.
Oh, thank you. Hi. Yeah, lots of compliments. Thanks a lot for this insightful presentations. I guess I would just a couple of clarifications, jump into the last presentation as well, whether you observed anything in terms of collective ownership, if we could, I mean, related to the tide aid in a way, because you mentioned parliaments and taxpayers. So what's the role of tide aid in it? You know, tied to specific interests. Also maybe to the first one, I was wondering, you mentioned civil society organizations, but whom do you actually mean there? And also in the case of Rwanda, how aid dependent the organizations are, as well as in the second case, so that could possibly explain their work with the governments too. And Shumei is not here, but in case if he still hears us, he mentioned that health is a donor darling in contrast to agriculture. So I was wondering if this also relates to the fact that, you know, sector-wide approach is implemented in health and education and maybe not in agriculture. So if you could reflect on this. But thanks a lot.
Okay, maybe take one last question and then we go to our speakers.
Thank you. I'm Annika Kaipola from the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland, and we have been considering a lot about this concept of ownership and participation and broad participation and inclusive participation, and in that connection we talk a lot about the whole of society approach or whole of government approach, because we should not only be talking about national governments, but also governments at local levels and municipalities, and we work a lot also with municipalities in for example, in the education sector. And the same goes with considering different partners, so whether they are the private sector, the civil society in its totality, whether it's the academia, the government. So how does this whole of society sort of approach resonate to you, and whether it's something that has come up in your research? This is perhaps a question for all of you. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we can give the floor to our speakers. I would say maximum 3 minutes in your replies. I think that should be feasible, and I'm just going to summarize the questions. So there was the one on populism and the impact of that on ownership. There was the one on the changing nature of development cooperation, for example, more symmetric, focused on global public goods. The question on collective ownership, the broader concept of ownership versus local ownership. Then question on how it relates to tide aids. A question on specific cases like Rwanda, or maybe also Ethiopia, where the question of independence, the independence of the stakeholders comes up, but also the question of donor darling. And the last question on what the impact is of the whole of society approach. So I think that most questions are actually relevant for all the speakers, but please feel free to also select the ones that are most relevant for these that are not specifically directed to you. I think that Deba thought that Stephen could start. Okay, so Stephen, go ahead.
Okay, I was hoping to go last. I'll just pick two. So the first one I'll pick is Stefan's question. Though I agree that we need to focus more on global public goods, the danger in the way you made it sound, or the way I heard what you said, was making it sound like we need to go all the way over towards that and leave behind the rest. And the danger, I would say, with that is, where does human rights fit in? In what I'm looking at, like if we, unless we redefine global public goods to include human rights, if we're focusing on the kinds of issues that you raise, which are super important and we need to focus on, and I'm not speaking against a global public goods approach, but if we focus too much on that, we're leaving other stuff behind. The second one I wanted to respond to was Anna, about the whole of government approach. I would say countries are terrible at a whole of government approach, and even worse at a whole of society approach. And just to give an illustration, Canada is trying to take a role in promoting LGBTQI+ rights internationally. You know, the government might organize a conference, invite activists from all around the world, and then that will come from our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is called Global Affairs Canada, and then the immigration people won't give these people visas because they say, well, they're activists, they don't have enough ties, they don't have stable employment, et cetera, so then they can't even come to Canada and talk about what the Canadian government invited them to talk about, including give advice to the Canadian government. So that's just an illustration about the lack of coordination within countries where the right hand and the left hand don't speak. I mean, it's been a problem for this conference. It's been a problem for so many academic conferences. It's actually quite scandalous, but I will end that there and pass it to Malin.
Thank you, and thank you for excellent questions. They are all huge, of course. I won't respond to them in 3 minutes. I will pick up on some of them. The new development landscape, the focus on global public goods. I think there would be lots of good reasons to focus on that, which would include sort of really focusing and starting out from our shared interests, shared responsibilities. Unfortunately, I don't see it coming. I wish that climate finance and the whole climate issue would move us in that direction. I wish that even traditional development aid would have had more focus on shared interests and responsibilities. But again, and I think there are even stronger reasons for it. You could argue for it, you could hope for it when it comes to climate change. But I'm not that optimistic. I'm sorry about that. But talking about the sort of more inclusive ownership, democratic ownership, all this, I am, of course, completely, I am very much focusing on the aid relationship, the relationship between aid providers and recipients. And I'm all for inclusive ownership and democracy and national policies being sort of responding to the population's needs, etc., etc. A problem I have with that widening of the ownership concept is that it takes away attention from the unequal power relationship between those who have the resources and those who receive them. And I think it's important to focus on that too. And I think this sort of widening of the ownership concept is a typical example of what happens to a buzzword or popular concept, including all kinds of desirable things. Yes, great. But on the way, I think we have lost focus on one thing that we tend to maybe often lose focus on. I think we came back to the power differences yesterday in many of the discussions. I think we need to focus on that as well. The more specific Rwanda question, how independent is civil society? Not. It's very sort of very, very, very controlled by the state. It's very much used, as I said. That's part of the picture is that civil society, CSOs, NGOs, they are aligned. They work together with the government in their activities. They work to help implement government policies. Many of them see that as their role, while the more critical ones are not accepted and are, well, not allowed to work, basically, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Malin. Should we maybe go to Shumei?
Yes. Can I?
Yes.
Okay.
Just 3 minutes for your answer to the most relevant questions for your...
Yes. I need to reflect on the two important issues. The issue of the change in the nature of collaboration and the development effectiveness coordination. So that is a very important view, and I agree with that point, because donors or providers have to, the convergence is very important. The convergence of goals will make that coordination to be and aid effectiveness of aid and development effectiveness to be more practical. Because what are these convergent areas? Definitely poverty could be a convergent area. It's an interest of both for the provider and then also for the recipient. It seems that the providers, not the issue of poverty, may not be, they may think that still poverty is the common agenda. If they are laced with poverty, this unemployment and productivity, and then also this migration, migrants, and then unemployment, all this, the climate change, very common agenda of the society. And then it's only if they converge and then the alignment and then aid converge in this area that they will have a joint ownership. Otherwise, we know that aid is also sometimes some aid are politically driven, and that's the relationship comes as agent and agent recipient kind of relationship, and that it doesn't work in the future. If we need to have this, the relationship is changing, and ownership and joint that the providers and the recipients will also join their efforts only when they have convergent goals that commonly achieved. And then I hope that these convergent goals are poverty, climate change, and immigration and unemployment. And that's why these days that multilateral kind of financing approach is more proactive, and then this bilateral kind of approach. So these are the changing nature of development in the development effect debates. I agree with that point. And then finally, the health and agriculture sector, yes, we know that the providers, especially from the south, from the north, and traditional donors are more in the social sector. That's why they are more in the health sector. Okay, social and education and health are very attractive for the donors, and they are missing, and then they are less in the production and economic sectors. From our studies, we can see that China, Turk, and then the south, developers, the providers from the south are more active in the production and economic sector. That's why that the health sector is more donor darling, and then still that agriculture sector, even though that importance is high, and that it contributes to the economy of developing countries like Ethiopia, that less interest and then less finance today compared to the health sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And then, as a last but not least, Deba, you have the floor.
Colleagues, you are very keen to go for your coffee? You see, when I was young, I had the feeling that I had answers to all the questions. Now I know that giving a good question itself is a great challenge in that way. So thank you very much for those questions and the observations you have made. And over time, I have been given the guidance that never engage in a debate with your fellow panelists. So I will also leave it on that and keep it for the tea break or coffee break. So there are basically two sets of questions. One is about the conceptual dimensions of the ownership discourse. And at least three of you have raised those issues from different angles. And then there is the other part of is the changing context. So one is the concept, another is the context regarding within which these changes are taking place in them. So coming back first on the concept issues. So on the issue of local elements of it, you see the point we make here is that we need to decompose or unpack the ownership from the national level to local level stakeholders in certain way, effectively. And also, within the government, it needs to be looked into from the line ministry or sectoral approach in that way. All the negotiations currently which takes place, either with the Ministry of Finance or the External Resource Division, whichever is doing the negotiation with the government, and there is prefatory, this a very formal token representation of the other stakeholders over there. So we are talking about unpacking the process, and more importantly, to have credible indicators to ensure that has taken place across the development cooperation value chain. So I don't think that this approach is very much in contradiction with the local ownership issue. Rather, it subsumes that. It is also the same issue is when we talk about the, the issue of whole of society approach. This brings us to one of the fundamental observations from our study. If you look at the GPEDC, although again, the fundamental point is that the rhetorics and the realities are different with the mandate of the GPEDC. GPEDC mandate specifically talks about contextualization of the interventions. But if you will see that most of the cases, the political economic and politico-institutional analysis is not deep enough. And that's why they do not distinguish between countries with democratic accountability, hybrid countries, and countries without democratic accountability. I won't use the word authoritarianism or populistic electoral authoritarianism over here. I need to go back to my country. So the issue is that this distinction is quite often not made explicitly. And as a result, they assume that all those mentions in the formalistic way are all in operation, which are not. And there are no indicators or assessment process to look at it at the end of the day. For example, how the ownership is going to get reflected in the results. Effectiveness debate, huh? So which means that in the results effectiveness, one will have to really consult the real participants, the word you use quite often is beneficiary, is how they really feel, whether they have at the disaggregated level not being left behind from the benefits of the project. So that process is not there. It needs a bit more deepening of the ownership debate, the concept operationally across the value chain as it goes in that way. One can talk about the tie date. Thankfully, after the Paris conference, most of the bilateral OECD DAC countries bilateral aid has been untied fully, particularly the grant element, but the tie date remains in technical assistance. That remains still in the OECD DAC. This is the last frontier of untying aid as we move forward in these cases over there. And the issue of donor darlings are not being there, and this is the debate, whether on the one hand, we want ownership, a strong government, but a strong government does not necessarily mean a democratic government. Yeah, I won't name names over here. And you know that is the other part of it, that if a strong government takes the guiding role and then does not really consult, it knows best, it doesn't need to consult its own citizen, that is a totally different paradoxical situation. GPEDC at this moment is a partial, closed shop, which does not look adequately into the ecosystem in which it is being implemented. That's a very strong fundamental statement. Sorry. Let me come to the second point on the context. Stefan raises, I fully agree with that. If you look at all the DAC OECD allocation trend, there are two trends which are becoming very, very clear. One is that they are doing more earmarking more in terms of the country and the sector. This is very obvious, which is, again, a tying in a different sorts. And it goes not only for the global public goods, but it is also for health, education, and other areas. It is for women, it's for children, and et cetera, et cetera. Earmarking from the ab initio. And whether it undermines the ownership of the country, recipient country, that's a different issue. The second thing which is happening with all the bilateral aid, we call it multilateralization of the bilateral aid. What is happening? Bilateral aid, in order to cut down its transaction costs, is allocating the money to international institutions, even to the World Bank and to the UN agency partly. This multilateralization of the bilateral aid is also creating a bit of a challenge to the ownership debate. And that's another issue because it comes through a totally different country frame in terms of allocation as it goes. The point is, at this moment, even if we allocate money to the global public goods, we have not worked out how specific countries benefit from it, the appropriation part of it, a global public goods, and the benefits which comes to this country through that burden. This is a serious methodological issue, that how do you really look at the appropriation of global public goods benefit as it goes. I'm pretty sure you and Wider will organize another session for that. Thank you very much. Good luck.
Thank you very much, Deva. Yes, we went over time, but I think it was worth it. We had, I think, a very interesting discussion covering on several topics. I think the issue of whose ownership, democratic ownership, was one that was coming back in all of the papers. Also the role of donors, the change also of the donor landscape and of the development cooperation and the way it is done. Came up several times. I think also maybe interesting is to look at specific sectors and whether that has an impact on whether ownership is possible, feasible. I think Stephen's paper, but also Shumei's paper was very interesting for that. And then also what it means practically to have ownership in terms of how do you organize donor coordination, policy dialogue, and then what is the impact. So I will end here. I'm sorry for going over time. If there are more questions, I think that maybe we now go for coffee and we can discuss them there. Thank you very much to the speakers, firstly, but also for you, for your questions, for your patience, and for your participation. Thank you.